Welcome everyone to the OutSystems user group. Tonight we're going to be covering empowering inclusion, so building accessible applications in OutSystems. Just before we start, I begin today by acknowledging the Wurundjeri people, traditional custodians of the land on which I join you today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. I extend that respect to the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia, and to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here today. So just a quick order of events. We're going to have the welcome and introduction, followed by the accessibility topics. So our first presenter this evening is Kobe Moore, who will explain why accessibility is important for the field and Accessibility Inclusive Jobs website. Kobe is a test analyst with a background in disability inclusion and digital design. Next up will be Rianne Van Buitenen, a senior technical business analyst at Phoenix DX. Rianne will step us through how different abilities impact user experience. Presenting on how to extend OutSystems accessibility and what you have to build, we have Stuart Harris. Stuart is the software development lead at Kyandra IT and was instrumental in leading the Fields.jobs website development team. And lastly, we have Farzan Karthik, is a senior project manager with Kyandra IT, previously working as a senior test analyst. Tonight, Farzan will explain how to use Lighthouse for accessibility testing. And now we'll move on to Kobe. Over to you.
Thank you, Mike. My name is Kobe. I'm the test analyst at the field. Today, I'm going to be talking to you about why web accessibility is important for the field and as an extension, why it's important for all websites. I'm going to be using some examples of color and contrast to demonstrate how everyone experiences the world differently. And I'm going to explore the web accessibility content guidelines for these two areas. Then following my presentation, there will be presentations that will delve deeper into other ways different abilities impact user experience and more detail about how to make web content as accessible as possible. So my personal experience of web accessibility barriers started in 2012 when I fell from a balcony and I broke my neck. After my accident, I was in what they call spinal shock and I was unable to move any part of my body below my neck. I was only able to use voice-activated assistive technology to access my computer, and I became quickly aware of the impact of badly designed websites and applications. As the spinal shock reduced, I did gain some movement in my arms, but not in my hands. I was able to use basic keyboard functions with a stylus strapped to my hand, which allowed me to use tab and spacebar and arrow keys to navigate websites, but I couldn't use a mouse. And if there was an issue with a website, for example, a keyboard trap or no visual focus, there was nothing I could do except wait for somebody to be available to help me, which led to many moments of frustration and feelings of helplessness. Since then, I have found a variety of technologies such as a trackball mouse, which has allowed me to have better access to websites and programs, but my passion to improve online accessibility for everyone was sparked. I joined the field as a test analyst in January this year. My decision to join the field was driven by my motivation to make websites accessible. I wanted to help remove barriers that people with disability face when searching and applying for a job, and I wanted to contribute to meaningful change in disability employment. Being someone who experiences disability firsthand, I regularly encounter barriers that deny me access to career growth. Therefore, the chance to be part of making a job platform as accessible as possible for people with disability is a cause very close to my heart. So what is the field? The field is a new job site built by people with disability for people with disability. It was founded by Dylan Alcott, who was the 2022 Australian of the Year, if you don't know who he is. So the field connects job seekers with disability to jobs from inclusive employers. Some things that I love about the field are that it's designed and built by people with disability, and accessibility and inclusion are at the core of everything we do. Our site supports job seekers with disability to have equal access to employment opportunities, and it supports organisations to enhance their inclusivity journey. Why do we exist? 4.4 million people identify as having a disability in Australia. That's around 1 in 6, or if you prefer percentages, 18% of people in Australia. Additionally, another 22% or 5.5 million people in Australia have a long-term health condition. So that's a lot of people that can experience barriers to employment or other services if web content is not presented in an accessible way. Often the first barrier that people with disability face when looking to apply for a job is web accessibility, with 89% of top career sites failing to meet accessibility standards and 46% of people with disability saying their last experience of applying for a job was difficult to impossible. There was a real need for the field. But it's not just job search platforms that are inaccessible. Before working at the field, I worked as an access and inclusion trainer, and a phrase I would regularly hear from organisations was, people with disability don't want to use our service, or people with disability don't come here. And when I asked them, well, how do you know? They'd say, well, we never have people with disability here. My response to this is, if you're offering a service that people in general like or want, I guarantee people with disabilities also want to access that service. How do I know? Because people with disability are just that. We are people. We are of all genders, all ages, come from all cultural backgrounds, and have a variety of interests, wants, and needs the same as everybody else. The reason that people with disability often don't use a service is not because they don't want to, but rather because they've been denied access. In the real world, this could mean there's no ramp or lift to access the building, or there's too much sensory overload in a shopping centre, so they can't feel comfortable in that space. But these barriers are not only physical. There are many barriers online that people with disability face that prevent them from accessing websites or online services. So this means if you're a service provider, you are instantly losing a customer and you don't even know it. So how do we make our website accessible? At the field, we use a mix of user feedback and consultation with people with disabilities alongside the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. As I have a limited time today, I will only be talking about how following the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines is a great way to start making online experiences accessible. I just want to highlight that consultation and user feedback are also important. Today, I'll be focusing on how the field uses colour and contrast. But again, I want to be clear that this is not because they're the most important guidelines. I've chosen them because I have limited time and they are an easy way to demonstrate how we all experience the world differently and how following the guidelines can remove barriers faced by people with disability. As a tester, I often get asked which guidelines are the most important. And the answer is they are all important. Each guideline addresses a different barrier a person with disability faces when using a website. Some guidelines make the web accessible for people who are blind or have low vision, some for limited movement, some for sensory or attention difficulties, and so on and so forth. So it's a range of different disabilities. Everyone experiences the world differently, and Rianne will go into more detail about this later in the presentation. Okay, so I chose to use colour as my example as it's an easy way to demonstrate how everyone experiences the world differently. On this slide is a screenshot of the field's homepage, demonstrating 6 different types of colour vision difference. The first segment on the left is trichromacy, which means a person has 3 independent channels for conveying colour information, and this is the way that the majority of human eyes perceive colour, but it's not the only way. When people have blue cone monochromatism, both the red and green cones do not function properly, while the blue cones work, and that example can be seen in the second segment. When people experience complete monochromacy, they perceive everything as shades of grey, which is demonstrated in the third segment. A person who experiences deuteranopia, also known as green blind, can only distinguish 2 to 3 different hues, as shown in the 4th segment, whereas somebody with normal vision sees 7 different hues. A person who experiences protanopia, also known as red blind, may have difficulty distinguishing between blue and green colours and also between red and green colours, and that's shown in the 5th segment. People affected by tritanopia or blue blindness often confuse blue with green and yellow with violet. An example of this is shown in the final segment. So in addition to these ways that are demonstrated on the slide, people with partial sight often experience limited colour vision, and many older users don't see colour very well either. So this example shows how even within the category of colour vision difference or colour blindness, there is still variety. Often it's thought that people who experience colour blindness just can't tell the difference between red or green, but that's not the case. There are many, many, many different ways people experience colour, and this is the same for all disabilities. We all experience disability differently. So now I'm just going to quickly talk about 2 web accessibility content guidelines that address visual difference. So 1.4.1, use of colour, addresses colour perception. This criteria requires that colour is not used as the only visual means of conveying information. So what does this mean for people with disability? On this slide, there's 2 examples of ways to indicate required fields. This is as an example of if a user has not completed any fields and they've clicked continue to verify your account button. So reflecting on my previous slide, if I had a colour vision difference that meant I could not perceive red, and the web developer has only used the colour red to indicate required fields, as shown in the left-hand side image, I would not be able to see which fields are mandatory. So the error message asking me to complete the mandatory fields that are marked in red would confuse me or frustrate me because I would not be able to tell. This criteria shouldn't in any way discourage the use of colour on a page. It just means colour needs to be complemented by other visual indications. For example, the image on the right still uses red to indicate required fields, but it also uses an asterisk to mark the required fields, and an error message indicator is displayed under each required field. The next guideline I'm going to talk about is contrast. So there are 2 actual guidelines relating to contrast, 1.4.3 contrast minimum and 1.4.6 contrast enhanced, which so they both use contrast ratios to guide developers to choose colours that will enable people with low vision or people who have colour vision difference to have adequate contrast between text and background. It's also important to note that using text over an image can cause contrast issues for people with low vision or colour vision difference. On this slide, you can see how background colour choice or using an image as a background can have a significant impact on the user's ability to read text. So choosing your brand colours is an important first step in making sure your website will be accessible. The field chose their brand colours to enable high-level contrast ratios with black font. This lilac colour is an example of one of our brand colours and is demonstrated, and as demonstrated on the slide, it passes both AA and AAA contrast standards. If we had chosen a darker shade, you can see the contrast ratio decreases, and although you might think to yourself, well, I can still read that pretty well, think back to my previous slide regarding the way people experience vision. And this is why the web content accessibility guidelines are so useful, as it doesn't rely on a personal perspective of the way things look. Instead, it gives you data to guide your decisions so that your product is as accessible to as many people as possible. This final slide is an example of a shade of purple that does not pass the contrast ratio with black text. Depending on how you see the world, you may still find this easy to read, or you may find it difficult. But remember, not everyone experiences the world as you do. So the guidelines, so use the guidelines to make your content as accessible as it can be for as many people as possible. Thank you for listening to me talk about accessibility and the field. Yeah, the following presenters will go through a range of other ways different abilities impact user experience, and they'll go into more detail about how to make web content accessible as it can be for as many people as possible.
Awesome. Thank you, Kobe. We'll move on to Rianne.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you, Kobe. That was very clear. It was for me very good to see all the color differences, and I will also link back a little bit to that. So what I'm going to talk about is how we can sort of integrate the accessibility within our designs. So I've been working for Phoenix for 3 years. But before that, I actually started in the very old area, last century, I think, when it was still all mainframe, and it was sort of a privilege for us to have a keyboard and a screen with black and green characters, green or orange. I think that was the choice that we had, but the background was black. So that has changed now. Now everyone has fully access to all sorts of devices, big or small, advanced or less advanced. But hey, is it actually all that accessible for everyone? 1 second. Yep. I have also, in my career, I've been involved in several projects that have impacted a lot of people, a lot of users and lives. And while we were doing that, we were focusing mostly on functionality and quality. And as that focus is, of course, correct, because if it doesn't do what it needs to do, or it does it, but mistakes break the system, that is no good. But what is good functionality and great quality when it is actually not accessible to a group of the intended users? So what Kobe said, very correct, and called out very correct. If we have an application there on the web, and we say, well, we don't have any of those users, that is possible because it is actually not accessible. It's like having a hospital without wheelchair access, as Kobe said. In the way that I was introduced to accessibility requirements was working with a government. The way I was introduced with accessibility was working with a government customer, and that was already a couple of years back. And all it was said was, it's the law and you have to follow these guidelines. And we went crazy with implementing that. And it's true, it's the law. Like governments do a lot of work to implement it in normal life. It's the law that government services need to be accessible to each member of the community. And the question here is, are our apps actually accessible to each member of the community? So Stuart will be talking a little bit more about accessibility guidelines for like the WCAG with different levels, and probably giving some great OutSystems tips along the way. Farzin will knows and can show us how to verify the compliance with these guidelines, showing the dev tools called, I think it's called Google Lighthouse. What I will be talking about is a little bit more the theory, not so much the why. Kobe has covered that very correct and very convincing. But I hope to give you and the team some insight and interest in the people we are creating for when we talk about accessibility, when we think about inclusiveness. Why will we need those insights and interests to be successful at inclusiveness? For that, I would like to illustrate that with a non-IT example. In my hometown in Gouda, I think other people say, that don't have the Dutch tongue. And yes, the town is where the cheese is made. It's in the Netherlands. And this actually only happened a couple of years ago. It's not that this is 10 years ago or something like that, and people didn't know better. But the government was renovating the central train station and the surroundings, which included safety for blind and visually impaired pedestrians to exit the central train station and then walk to the hospital. That was a good 15 minutes walk. So this included tactile indicators, like those pavers with the wobbles that you can keep on walking over, and that on the sidewalk, and indicators for traffic lights, where the moment you press the button, you hear the beep, 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 and things like that. So that was all very well implemented. And then also for safety at night and on those very dark days in the Netherlands where it's very gloomy and you actually need your light on the whole day. There were some lamp posts, what a word, needed. And those lamp posts were implemented with a very bright color, so even when you're drunk, you don't walk into them. So that's a very good initiative, and all the guidelines were followed. So all is good. And Mike, can you go to the next slide, because this was the result. So yeah, just telling you what I see here. It's one of those blind guidelines with a lamppost in the middle. So all the guidelines were followed, but someone made a mistake probably. So Michel van Lokeren, so he uses that path daily. And he uses it actually to go from his house to the train station. And his reaction to this, like we can laugh about it a little bit because it looks stupid, and we have really the feeling, well, that makes no sense at all. But what he says is that a lot of people leave their bikes and rubbish or scraps are not cleared from those guidelines. And that is already annoying enough. But what hurted him, and that is where I want to go to, the government even makes it worse by putting a lamppost on one of those guidelines, of one of those paths. So for him, he knows that there's a whole community out there, and sometimes you just leave a bike. But if the government also doesn't work with you, the reaction from the government was actually, there was probably not enough conversations and things like that, and people were just following what was said on paper. That's not good enough. I do think people who are working together in a team, we can all be a little bit more aware of our surroundings, of the people who will need that guideline to use. If I'm installing a lamppost, I'm not going to install it on that guideline. So what I wanted to make clear with this is, if we all put ourselves into understanding and empathy for other people, then it becomes a team effort to get to that accessibility and to get to those guidelines and to get to the right result. So that was a bit my message from the beginning. It's not only the person who does the design who is involved in accessibility. It's not only the developer, not only the tester. It's for everyone. But now it's the question: how do we create that understanding? And I would like to introduce some personas, which also include some do's and don'ts together with those personas. I had a look because I'm currently also on a project that has something to do with accessibility. And probably the best place to look for more information is the government, because they have some very good extra information about accessibility. And this is something that I found on the NHS. That's I think the UK healthcare system. So they have for developers, designers, for testers, they have a nice guideline of the do's and don'ts. They have set up some personas. They even have set up some Chrome profiles that you can use, so that you can actually see how people are affected by maybe using your website, or by the ability, how they are affected by the ability that they have, the different ability that they have, and also even screen readers can be then installed, so that you can actually experience what other people are experiencing. So we will have designs for the following group of users. So the users who are using screen readers, the users with physical and motor disabilities, users with low vision, users on the autistic spectrum, users with anxiety. This is probably the latest that was added to the list of personas. Users who are deaf or hard of hearing, and users with dyslexia. I want to walk you through each of these personas. I am going to try something for the first time with some of these personas by showing it in the browser with a test page, and with showing how that page is actually perceived by the person. But I can't do that for all. I can't pretend to have a screen reader, because then you all have to come into this bedroom and look over my shoulder, and that's probably not advisable. Ashley, she's 24 years old. Ashley is a partially sighted screen reader user. And she works, but at work she has a support worker to help her with some of the paper-based work, but also help her convert some of the documentation into Word documents, so that the screen reader can pick it up better. All she wants to do is she wants to be able to use any website she wants. And she wants to be more independent. How she was affected by a website, it's not mentioned what website, by a website, was that she couldn't buy her sister the present she really wanted for her birthday, because none of the fields were labeled on the website. So just a simple thing where we I just expect everything to work. But just a simple thing, she couldn't buy the present for her sister. So I am not sure if it's readable. So from the NHS, here are some do's and don'ts for this user, for this persona. So and I'm only going to mention the do's and maybe jump out to the don'ts at some stage. But what we need to do is describe images and provide transcripts for video. And we need to follow a linear logical layout. So if you look at the two screens, one at the right is really spread content all over the place. With a screen reader, you're actually the screen reader is going to read the screen, and if that keeps on jumping, that is how do you say that, disturbing for people. Structure content using HTML5. Built for keyboard use only. So and that really surprised me, that with accessibility, the use of keyboard only with using the tabs from one field to the other, and making sure that nothing in your application falls outside of the tab order is becoming very important again. And I know that it was before, when we were all using Oracle Forms or something like that, that was important. But now it is important again. And we have to write descriptive links and headings. So instead of click here, it needs to actually describe what you do when you click there. Chris, and he is 53 years old, and he has arthritis. I can't say the first word, so he has arthritis in my world, and he works at as a management accountant. He wants to also have software that works more with the keyboard, and he wants to be able to use any website at all. So if we look at the do's, he wants large clickable actions. Because of his arthritis, it's really painful for him to use the mouse. And if he needs to use the mouse, it needs to be big, because he can't really orientate on it. Give clickable elements space. So don't make the fields like 6 fields in a row. Design for keyboard or speech only use. Design for mobile and touch screen in mind, and provide shortcuts. So for Chris, I have followed the NHS tutorial on how to set up my Chrome to be able to impersonate those personas. So we have Chris, he's 53, he's color vision deficiency, and he has arthritis. The NHS has a nice test page for this. So let's say what I installed here is a stylus, and I also installed, what was it? Temper Monkey. So for Chris, we are going to put the screen to monogram. So at this moment, I've untouched it. At this moment, we have this screen. So we see a couple of colors, and we see here the question mark. So now we're going to see what impact that has on this very simple page. So we have the monochrome, so we don't have colors anymore. But here it says click the green button. So yes, I can't make a decision which one is green. And I'm going to remove the cursor. So at this moment, I don't have a mouse anymore. My mouse only works until there. And now I don't have a mouse. If you now look at what happens when I use the tab on, for example, a simple screen like this, I am here on the back button. I can't use my mouse to point it out. And when I press the tab, it actually immediately goes to the buttons there below. So I have no coverage in that area that is completely in the middle. So that is something that one of the test tools can pick up. And I will now make sure that I have my mouse back because it becomes really irritating for me because I'm not used to it. Claudia is 54 and she uses a screen magnifier. For that, the do's are we have to have the good color contrast from what Kobe already said. We have to publish all informations on web pages, so not so much more downloads and images and things like that. Use a combination of color, shapes, and text. So not just the 3 buttons, but make it green and have the text in the button. Follow a linear logical layout so that with 20% of magnification you can still see everything on the screen, 200%, but also make sure that all of a sudden pop-up boxes don't fall out of that 200 magnification so that you have to go and look for it. And put buttons and notifications in context. So don't make sure that they stay together in Powell. He's 24. He has Asperger's. That is a condition on the autistic spectrum. Also for him, use simple colors. Write in plain language. Do this. Use simple sentences and bullets, make buttons descriptive, and build simple and consistent layouts. And then we have Ron. He is one of our older personas. He is 82, and he has multiple conditions. That's where we have to actually give the users enough time to complete an action, because it can take a little bit longer than when a tester follows one screen. Explain what will happen after completing a service. Make more important information clear, so make it really stand out. Give users the support they need. So even if you want them all to fill it in on the website, also give them the option to make a phone call or a web chat. And let users check their answer before they submit them. Salim is 22, and he is a profoundly deaf and is fluent in Australian Sign Language. For deaf and hard hearing, the plain language is very important because they potentially grew up with a different language, and that is Australian Sign Language. So it is sort of the same as English, but English is still a complete different language. You use subtitles. Even when it's a song and that song has meaning for your website, make sure that the lyrics are subtitled. Again, use a linear and logical layout. Break up content with subheadings, images, and videos, and let user ask their preferred communication support when booking appointments. So for deaf and hard hearing, make sure that you can communicate via email and not all over the phone. And then Simone, she is 41, dyslexic user. I can probably show that one very quick because to be honest, I liked that one. If we go to the dyslexic user, we just use this page. I can, with the scramble monkey, No, it's Temper Monkey, isn't it? I can use, for example, scramble letters. And if I then use it for this page, I press F5. And this is what a dyslexic person will see on your page. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, Rianne. Fantastic presentation. And now we're over to Stuart.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, Rianne. That was amazing. And just in case if you're worried we might be going over time, Rianne's just explained some of the stuff that I was going to explain, but much better. So I think we're going to be all right.
Thank you.
Don't panic. I'm Stuart Harris. I'm a software development lead at Kyandra. I'm going to be talking about, extending OutSystems accessibility, what some call A11y, to kind of be designy and clever. And just talk a little bit about then like what you need to build. We're going to cover, well, what accessibility features we get in OutSystems UI already. OutSystems UI being the user interface framework in OutSystems. I'm going to cover just kind of briefly, because we've kind of gone over it a little bit, what you need to do for your web application content. Then we'll talk a little bit about ARIA. Unfortunately, for those really interested in music, we're not going to be talking about the Australian Music Awards. And then talk a little bit about extending OutSystems UI. What do you get? And you've got to tell me to stop asking questions instead of saying stuff, because I think that I was wrong. What do you get in OutSystems UI with respect to accessibility? Well, I'm glad you asked. Most of the widgets are already accessible. Most of the reason for that is because they're really just valid HTML. Now there's some great advice that we've seen and some great examples where things haven't been very accessible. We've seen tonight so far. But if you follow the HTML principles and use valid HTML, you're a lot of the way there. Another thing that you get in OutSystems UI is it's a responsive UI. Remember, Rianne showed us when you change the size of a page, it needs to sort of restructure. We know that HTML does that, so let's just use HTML as we should, and OutSystems UI does, and restructures the content that we have when you change the size of the screen. There's a sneaky little feature in the OutSystems UI layouts. It's a parameter called Enable Accessibility Features, and it's switched off by default. Why is it switched off by default? That's a question that I think is okay for me to ask, but it should be switched on. But anyway, you just go in and set the default to true on your layouts. And suddenly what happens is whenever you tab to something, remember Rianne was showing us when you tab to something, it's kind of hard to see where you are. You get a bright highlight around things that are focused to show you that you've got focus, which is helpful for some people. For others, it might not be, but you get that. So it'll links and input controls, and whatever you can put focus on, it'll put a border around it. A skip to content suddenly appears. So what will sometimes happen with a page, if you're using assistive technology, you'll have to read through the whole menu, before you get to the content that you're actually interested in. And then you go to another page and you have to read through the whole menu again. So a skip to content is there. So it'll be the first link that appears when you tab, and then you can just activate that and it'll go straight to the content. So you get that for free. Accessibility links will get a higher contrast, and also the text will get a higher contrast by default. However, what we always do is we change the theme we customize the theme for our own sort of color set. And often what we do there is that higher contrast won't really work anymore. So we just should make sure that our colors, like Kobe was showing us, that our colors have enough contrast anyway. So that's probably not that useful, to be honest, but let's just not mention that to OutSystems. And there is a little client action that's available that will toggle increased text spacing on. Say that 3 times fast. Increased text spacing. So you can, but you need to actually enable that, put that on your layout somewhere so someone can activate it, because you don't know if you should activate it or not. So that's what you get. Now, in terms of web application content, essentially, we need to make sure we have equivalent functionality for everyone. And we've gone on about that, so I'll just move on. For web application content, there's 4 important features that it should have. It should be perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. But Stu, what does that mean? Well, so perceivable means everyone can perceive it. So whether they can hear it, see it, feel it. And what we need to do is make sure all of our controls and our inputs are labeled. OutSystems does that by default when you create forms. Just don't break it. But if you do sort of manually create your own forms, then make sure that you have your labels associated with your input controls. Time-based media, videos, audio, and we've heard before, make sure there's a text equivalent, or even for AAA level accessibility compliance, include sign language. Now, I'm really summarizing all of this. There's a link a little bit earlier, but if you just search for W3 accessibility, there's a whole lot of all of this information is there. So I'm just summarizing it. It's really well explained, so give yourself time to read it. In fact, that's your homework. The next thing, here's a controversial one, captures. Now, there was a time when we just say, look, if you want your site to be accessible, don't use a capture. Because think about it, what a capture does, I nearly asked a question there. What a caption does is it stretches your sensory abilities as a user to make sure that you're not a robot. So that's counter to what we're trying to do. We're trying to make it easier for people. The capture's trying to make it harder. But the reason we use captures is to make our sites secure. So we have to dance a bit of a balance here. So the recommendation now is if you need to make sure people aren't robots, then use multiple types of capture. Don't just use visual. Allow an option for audio as well. Allow an option for maybe a text puzzle. But here's the kicker, is have an ability for a user to ask for someone to switch the capture off for them. So then that user, their user ID is sort of identified so that they don't need to use a capture. So that will actually make your site accessible, but also keep it secure. Right. Moving on. So decoration on our sites is nice, makes them look great. But if it's not required, then you need to actually make sure it's hidden from assistive technology, because it can be confusing for people. For example, if you have a beautiful sort of image in the background, but it's not needed to actually operate your site, if it's an image, if you don't put an alt tag on it, I didn't know this until very recently. If you don't put an alt tag on it, assistive technology will read out the file name of the image. Cody's nodding. It's really annoying And especially if the file name just doesn't make any sense, like it's just a bunch of random letters. So you can use an area hidden. I'll be talking about this later. You can use an area hidden attribute, but you can also just make it alt, the alt tag, just make it empty. Put it in there, make it empty. It'll be ignored. I'm going to move on a bit quicker now. Adaptable, we already saw that. Make sure that your content is organized, has a meaningful sequence, is responsive. Also that the purpose is explained for what you're doing. Distinguishable, we saw about that. Make sure you've got enough color contrast, text size, audio is sort of loud enough, operable. You need to be able to use it. So it needs to be keyboard accessible, but also if you can't use the keyboard, you need to be able to do things with the mouse as well. So just make sure that if someone's only using a keyboard, they can still operate the site. If you're showing information that, or if there's any sort of animation or things that disappear, make sure people have enough time to see them. In fact, things that are disappearing on their own is not considered good accessibility. How long does someone need to read it? I don't know. So if something does disappear, make it a user action that makes it disappear. They don't necessarily have to click on it or interact with it, but it might just be hitting the submit button makes the error messages disappear. Should do that anyway, really, shouldn't we? I might not go and explain every single part of this. Now, we talked about perceivable. Ryan showed us that sometimes, even if you can perceive it, you can't understand it. So make the language simple enough for people to understand. Make the site predictable. So normally we have a label and then an input control, for example. Don't put the input control and then the label, or don't just put things in sort of odd, unexpected ways. Make the site predictable for your users. In terms of input assistance, like explanations or validation messages, make sure they're also available and they have the right contrast. We saw a little bit of that earlier, so let's just move on. But understandable also covers validation messages and instructions. Now, the robust part of things is really just about making sure your HTML is valid. OutSystems generates valid HTML. You don't have to worry about it. There is one thing that's of interest, though, well, it's all interesting, but that I want to explain about the robust part of web content, and that is status messages. There's an idea of a role for each element of HTML. Now, if you use role equals status, that tells assistive technology that piece of content is a status message. And then the assistive not can decide whether to announce that straight away to the person using it based on their preferences or not. So, for example, when you submit a form and then you say, hey, hang on, there's a whole bunch of fields there that you didn't enter, you might express it in a little bit nicer way than that, but that you would want to highlight that expression with role equals status. Right. And so in terms of OutSystems UI, the toast feedback messages that you get, they already have role status, and pagination also has status. Because you imagine if you go to the next group of records in a table, the pagination updates, and that's a form of status update. Right, what is ARIA? ARIA means accessible rich internet applications. And essentially what it is It's 150 declarations on top of HTML that we use so that assistive technologies, the screen reader is an assistive technology, can present a web page. So here's an example. You might have the text home on your web page, but it could be a heading, could be a link, a button, could be the label for a phone number. So if your code doesn't say what type of thing it is, the assistive technology can't really tell the person using it what it is. So the declarations are defined by the WAI area specification at that hyperlink. All this stuff is at w3.org. Now, the first rule of ARIA, not Fight Club, the first rule of ARIA is only use it when HTML is not enough, or when HTML doesn't work for you. So nowadays, when ARIA first appeared, HTML wasn't as mature and needed a lot of help. Nowadays, HTML5 is really good. Almost all the elements have default roles. So you don't need to use ARIA very much at all. Sometimes you still do, though. The most popular one, I would say, is ARIA label. So here's an example of a button. Now this button here is the little menu burger at the top of a mobile screen. So how is someone meant to know that that's the menu? I'm glad you asked. You use ARIA label and you put in menu. And so the assistive technology will let the person know that this is the menu. In fact, you know what? I would make that main menu instead of just menu. But that's just me. Right, so you can use these on any element. So that's just one example, but that's a really popular one. ARIA hidden is another one. Now, remember I was talking about decoration before. So here's another, that's where you might use ARIA hidden. Here's a hyperlink. So here's the HTML for a hyperlink. It's kind of like reading HTML. It's kind of like the matrix, isn't it? It's like you see a whole lot of numbers on the screen and then you imagine a web page. Sorry, I'm digressing. And Mike's already given me a 5-minute warning. So that's a hyperlink. And that little I element is an icon. How is that useful to assistive technology? Not very. So we can use the ARIA hidden attribute to say, don't worry about the icon, just ignore it. And this is the home link. The role attribute, now that doesn't start with ARIA, but so it's part of HTML5, really. And this next one is a div element, but we're styling it, we're using it like a button. So what we do is we put in the role attribute and say, I know I'm using a div, but this is actually a button. And assistive technology will just go, yep, no worries, it's a button. Oh, it's a save button, fine. It's also using another ARIA element, ARIA pressed, saying, so this is a toggle button. It could be a toggle button. It says save, so as if that's a toggle button, but that's another element that you can use. In fact, if you inspect the HTML of this Google Meet, like I did earlier, the chat icon there has an ARIA label and it says ARIA pressed false or true, depending on whether you're showing the chat or not. So that's great. Right, I'm going to move on. ARIA label by is just the reverse of ARIA label, but you just kind of say, this element over here is the label for this thing. Okay, there's 150 of them, so, Okay, so here we go. Into the nuts and bolts, coding practices. We've talked about the image alt attribute. That's where you put the description of your images. Enough said. Headings. Now, I didn't know this either until recently. You can't skip headings on a web page. It's valid HTML, but it's not valid for accessibility. So you can't have heading 1 and heading 3 We've all done it. Stop doing it. And start with heading 1, please. It's not actually valid if you use other headings than heading 1 anyway. So take that. Form validation. So here's an interesting one. OutSystems doesn't actually do this. There's an area flag on controls called or attribute area of invalid. It's kind of the reverse. So if you've got an input control that's invalid, like it's a name and you didn't put anything in there, you need to put area invalid true if it's not valid. That's a bit annoying. So, but it's something you do need to do on all of your potentially invalid controls. I'll just make a comment on this and then move on. But often putting the focus on the first invalid field, that's something that we often do. It's not necessarily the best thing to do. There's actually a bit of controversy around that. So I'm just going to leave that and move on. Button groups. In OutSystems, button groups, there's something that's a little bit broken with accessibility. There was the last area attribute on the previous slide was the what was it? Descendant something. The selected descendant. Button groups get that wrong. What they do is they'll actually put the value of the variable as the active descendant instead of the ID of the control. So the trick there is you actually, in your button groups, make the value and the name of your element the same value. That's a bit annoying, but that will actually make it, when someone's using assistive technology to look at a button group, it will then tell them which one's selected. So, bit of a pain. Right, and for radio buttons, a radio button group, you have to give it an area label, even if you've got a label associated with a radio button group control. And the reason that is because JAWS doesn't read radio button groups labels properly. So remember that one. Radio button group, area label, JAWS doesn't read it properly. Extending OutSystems UI accessibility, the upload control doesn't have keyboard navigation. It's easy to add. I'll show you in a second. Multi-select drop down isn't accessible. You're going to have to go and find an accessible JavaScript drop down that you can use. So that's just the multi-select one though. But still, what a pain. The video and audio player isn't totally accessible. So we'll generally use a JavaScript, accessible JavaScript control plugin for that. Whenever you are using third-party controls, you really have to evaluate them for accessibility. Most of them aren't. So just assume that they're not before you find out they are. Because you don't want to be just dropping a control on your site, then someone can't use it. Enough said. And any custom controls you build, just make sure they're following those guidelines. So it's not rocket science, but it is something that you have to be aware of and something you have to do. Let's have a look at the next slide. So this is what you need to do to make the upload control accessible. It's easy. First of all, you can't tab to it. What a pain. All you need to do though is give it a tab index equals 0, then it'll tab to it. Remember, Rhiannon was telling us about making sure your tab order is correct. Our browsers do that for us now. So you don't need to put an actual number in the tab index. You just put 0, and then however things are rendered on the screen, it'll tab through it in order. Beautiful. Next, now you can tab to it, but you still can't open it. Why not? Well, it's because it doesn't actually listen to space or enter when you've got focus. So all you need to do is add an onKeyUp event, add this little JavaScript widget, and put this code in here. Is the key code 32? We all know 32 is space, don't we? Yeah. And key code 13, we know that's entered, don't we? Yes, gee, we do. So then we just go get the element, find the input, and then click it. Easy. Now you've got an accessible upload control. 30 seconds. See if you can get faster than that. And finally, when you're building custom input controls, just make sure you're using valid HTML. Ensure the label's associated. If it's a radio button, make sure you're using area label as well. Thanks, Jaws. Make sure you have validation messages for validation states. Make sure you have a focus state highlight. You might have to do some custom CSS to make that work. And make sure you do accessibility testing on your control and your whole app.
Awesome. Thank you, Stuart. Now we do have a question in the chat from Riley. Does OutSystems automatically use semantic container elements, e.g. section, article, and aside?
There's no actual section, article, or aside elements, but OutSystems has just the HTML element. So and also you can actually tell containers to change the element that they're in. But that's kind of a hangover from traditional web. So just use the HTML element and just say it's a section. So it doesn't have any widgets necessarily, but yes, it does have it because that's just part of your content. Great question. Thanks, Riley.
And now moving on to Farzan.
Hey everyone, finally it's my turn to talk, I guess. I've been waiting for this for a very long time. Anyway, I'm one of the senior QAs from Kyandra, and today I'm here to talk about Lighthouse tool for accessibility testing. And in this session, we will cover introduction to Lighthouse, what are some of the common accessibility issues that it can help us find, how to run that tool, and also some of its limitations. So Lighthouse is a tool that is developed by Google. It is an open source tool for web application analysis. So what it basically does is it runs an audit through the web application, a web page of a web application. So we have to run it page by page. And at the end of the audit, it provides some insights and recommendations on accessibility, performance, best practices, and search engine optimization. So there are various factors we can audit. Let's just focus on accessibility for this session. And as a part of those audits, it basically runs some automated tests and it identifies accessibility issues. Now, to run the automated test, it obviously has to compare the web page to a set of guidelines. And the latest version of Lighthouse adheres to the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1. And that's how it actually supports to create more inclusive and accessible web experiences. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of it because Stu and Ariana and everybody has actually covered what those issues are, but some of the issues that Lighthouse helps us identify is missing alternate text on images, insufficient color contrast, missing form labels, and also some of the keyboard navigation problems. Like how Stu said, we should be in a position to navigate around a web application without having to use a mouse. We need to use just the keyboard controls to navigate around. And without those alternate text for images, the screen reader is not going to help the user understand what that image is. So, again, there's a context loss there. Again, insufficient color contrast. Same thing for visually disabled community. That's very important. And again, missing form labels, screen reader issue. It's not going to be able to tell the user what that field is all about. Okay, now quickly running a demo about running the tool. So to run the tool, I've opened a Chrome browser, and I'm just going to open Kyandra's homepage or Kyandra's application to do the audit here. And with the website, I'm going to only do the audit on this particular homepage of Kyandra. So for that, you click on the F12 on your keyboard, it opens up the dev tools, or you could just right click and do inspect and it'll open up the dev tools for you. One of the tabs that you'll see is a lighthouse. Click onto that one. And if you see, there are a couple of modes in here. Navigation is the default one, which will actually help you audit the page as it is. So if you have no interactions or anything, that's the best, and that's the default, and that's what I prefer to use it, because when I do the testing, I do it page by page. So have the navigation mode selected, and you can decide on the device. So say, for example, if you want to check it on mobile, then obviously it's also looking for its responsiveness. But for this demo, let's just select desktop. And like under the categories, we have performance, accessibility, best practices, and all of these options that I've told. But for this session, let's just stick on to accessibility. So once we have the settings done, we just click on analyze the page load and give it about 10 to 20 seconds for it to do the audit, run its own tests, and generate the score for us. So yeah, so if you say it's given a 93, a score of 93, which is pretty good in my opinion, but it also has given us suggestions and recommendations on improving that score as well. So if you see the first one, it says, the frame or the iframes do not have a title. So again, it's the screen reader issue. It also gives us the reason why this is an issue. It says screen readers users rely on the frame titles to describe the contents of the frame. So it gives the reason as to why this is important and why you should be fixing it. If you're still not convinced, you could just click on the learn more about frame titles, and it will give you a detailed documentation of the guidelines that it is not adhering to, how to fix the problem, why it matters, and the rule description and everything. So you could take a read and you could decide to fix that. Similarly, it has links do not have an understandable name. It doesn't have a language attribute. So some of them wouldn't be valid for us. In that case, we could internally decide among ourselves and decide not to fix it. But if you fix all of this, the score will definitely improve from 93. The other best part of this tool is that it also gives us some additional items to manually check. So if you click on that, it says the page has a logical tab order. Some of the issues that Stu mentioned would also be in here. So whichever dev is going to work on this web page to improve the score can go through all of it and fix up, and it will also show what are the audits that have passed. So it's got a good documentation, and also some of the suggestions and improvement on how to improve the score. So this is me running the tool manually. I haven't personally tried it, but there are ways where you can integrate your Lighthouse tool to your CI/CD pipeline. So every time a developer builds a website, and when it's getting built to be deployed, you can run Lighthouse as a tool by default, and it'll give you a score, and you can configure rules around it has to be about 90 or 95 or whatever that we decide internally or with the client. So this is how we run the tool manually. So yeah, this is just a sample report I had in case for some reason I wasn't able to give the demo or so. I thought I should still have the report. And this is from another website where it only shows 82%. And these are similar reports that we generate and we send it to developer for them to work on and improve the score. Now, limitations. So our Lighthouse is again an automation tool. So obviously it comes with a bunch of limitations itself, and we need to understand what the limitations are so that we can use that accordingly. One is automated testing limitation. Now, this is a very common limitation with any of the automation tool, not just Lighthouse. No automation tool can cover 100% of scenarios, so the coverage is definitely limited. And we definitely need someone to go and manually check some of the scenarios or edge case scenarios where Lighthouse cannot really perform. The second one is limited contextual understanding. Now, Lighthouse runs the audit with a couple of automation tests that's built within. So it uses certain algorithms to run those tests, and they're very standard. So, obviously, if you want to have a custom coverage for a particular website, again, it lacks a little bit in that area. False positives and negatives. So this is also a typical, automation tool issue. I've worked with other UI automation tools, and it's the same there as well. It's just not the Lighthouse. Some genuine issues can get masked, and sometimes the report would just say it works. And some of the issues that were failing are actually a pass. So it tries to give some sort of false report, but the margin is really less. So we don't have to really worry about it. But I thought, it's still good to highlight as it's an automation tool. The fourth one is lack of personalized recommendation. Now, sometimes it happens that we tend to build website targeting a particular audience. In that case, Lighthouse is not in a position to understand that and customize the tests based on those targeted audiences. It will still continue to give a very general opinion and a score that would involve all sort of tests. So in situations like that, the score may be probably less. But then it's again, something that we need to internally discuss with the stakeholders and to explain to them. Incomplete assessment of complex interactions. Now, I'm not a developer myself, but I understand, some of the websites, the technologies they use are pretty complicated, with their user interactions, like they use Ajax and, complicated JavaScript interactions. I might be blabbering, but yeah, that's what I'm assuming. So in those type of things, Lighthouse struggles a little bit around those, doing the accessibility on those interactions. And lack of accessibility expertise. No matter how much we run the tool, we still need an expert to come in and use a screen reader and get hands-on and run to see if it's completely accessible. But the advantage is, if you use Lighthouse early on in the software development lifecycle, as and when we build the web page, we run this, we generate a good score, we have that. We find most of the issues, like how Stu said, OutSystems is already, pretty accessible. So in those cases, we have a good score. And then at the end, if you bring about an expert to do, a final round of testing, then it's more easier for them as well. And it's not that stressful. Otherwise, bringing in an expert for everything, they can get frustrated as well, if we haven't met any of the accessibility needs. So that's the lack of expertise thing. So finally, I'd just like to say that accessibility is not just a legal requirement, it's also a moral obligation from everyone. And Lighthouse is, one of those tools, one of those many tools that are available in the market that can actually help us identify some common accessibility issues. And as a responsible engineers who has anything to do with software development, we should probably be looking to create a more inclusive digital world. And this is not just going to help the disabled community, but it'll also improve the overall experience for all of the users. So yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thank you so much. Keep an eye out for the next OutSystems user group. And if you do have anything that you'd like to present, please contact us, and we'd be more than happy to have you up on stage and sharing your wisdom with us.
This is a really important issue, and we want to make sure that the message gets out there. Accessibility matters because it makes technology available to everybody.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks. Well done, everyone.
Well done, everyone.
Thank
Thanks.
you. Well done.
Thanks, everyone.